The rain came down like bullets on Interstate 40, each drop exploding against Frank Morrison's windshield with the fury of 1,000 tiny detonations. Through the rhythmic sweep of his wipers, he saw them, a woman, a man, and 2 small children, huddled together on the shoulder of the highway, soaked to the bone, their thumbs extended in a gesture that seemed more like prayer than hitchhiking. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Company policy was clear. No riders. Ever. He'd driven 18-wheelers for 23 years without breaking that rule once. The rain hammered harder, and in his rear-view mirror, he watched the family grow smaller, their figures blurring into the storm like ghosts dissolving into mist. "Damn it," he muttered, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. The air brakes hissed like a serpent as he pulled onto the shoulder 300 yards ahead. Through the rain-streaked mirror, he saw them running, the father carrying the smaller child while the mother pulled the older one along, their feet splashing through puddles that reflected the gray apocalypse of the sky. When they reached the passenger door, Frank leaned over and pushed it open. The woman's face appeared first, rain streaming down her cheeks, mixing with what might have been tears. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 30, with dark eyes that held equal parts desperation and dignity. "Thank you," she gasped, her voice nearly lost in the storm's roar. "Thank you so much." "Get in before you all catch pneumonia," Frank said gruffly, helping pull the children up into the cab. The kids were shivering, their lips tinged blue. The boy looked about 7, the girl maybe 4. The father climbed in last, a thin man with calloused hands and defeat written across his weathered face. As Frank pulled back onto the highway, the cab filled with the smell of wet clothes and desperation. He cranked up the heat, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engine's deep rumble, the rain's assault, and the children's chattering teeth. "I'm Maria," the woman said finally. "This is my husband, Carlos, and our children, Miguel and Rosa." Frank nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "Frank Morrison, where you folks headed?" "Phoenix," Carlos said, his accent thick, but his English clear. "My brother has work for me there. Construction." "That's another 200 miles, Frank said. "What happened to your car?" Maria and Carlos exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that only comes from years of shared struggle. "It died 50 miles back," Maria said quietly. "We've been walking for hours. We tried to call for help, but—" She held up a phone with a shattered screen. "We had an accident last week. This is all we have left." In the back of the cab, little Rosa started crying, a soft, exhausted sound that cut through Frank's chest like a blade. Maria pulled her daughter close, whispering words in Spanish that sounded like a lullaby and a prayer woven together. Frank had rules. He'd always had rules. After his wife Sarah died 7 years ago, rules had been the only thing holding him together. Wake at 5. Coffee black. Drive. Stop only when necessary. Call his daughter Emily on Sundays. Don't get involved. Don't let anyone in. Rules were the walls that kept the grief from drowning him. But something about this family, their quiet dignity, their refusal to complain despite being one catastrophe away from sleeping under a bridge, made those walls feel thin and fragile. "You folks eating today?" he asked. Silence answered him. Frank nodded slowly, his decision already made. "There's a truck stop about 40 miles ahead. We'll get some food in you before we go any further." "We don't have money for—" Carlos began, but Frank cut him off. "Didn't ask if you had money. Asked if you'd eaten." At the truck stop, Frank bought hamburgers, fries, hot chocolate for the kids, and coffee for the adults. He watched as Miguel and Rosa devoured their food with the intensity of children who'd gone too long without. Maria's hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, and Carlos couldn't quite meet Frank's eyes. "Thank you," Carlos said, his voice thick. "We'll pay you back someday. I promise you this." Frank waved him off. "Forget it. Just eat." As they sat in the booth, Rosa reached across the table and put her small, warm hand on Frank's weathered one. "You're nice," she said simply, and Frank felt something crack open in his chest. Something he kept sealed since Sarah's funeral. Back on the road, with the family warm and fed, the conversation began to flow. Maria told him about their journey from Tucson, where Carlos had lost his job when the factory closed. about selling everything they own for a chance at a new start, about Rosa's birthday tomorrow, and how they'd promised her cake, but now had nothing to give her. Frank told them about his own daughter, Emily, who lived in Seattle and rarely called anymore, about the grandchildren he'd never met, because the distance between them had grown wider than geography, about Sarah, and how the road had become both his escape and his prison after she'd gone. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust, Miguel pointed out the window. "Look, Papa, Phoenix." The city emerged from the heat-shimmer horizon like a promise, its buildings catching the dying light. Carlos gave Frank his brother's address, and Frank navigated the big rig through the evening traffic with the practiced ease of a man who'd driven every highway in America. When they pulled up outside a modest apartment complex, a man who looked like an older version of Carlos came running out. The reunion was loud and emotional, with rapid Spanish and tight embraces. Frank stayed in the cab, watching, feeling like an intruder in someone else's miracle. Maria came to his window, tears streaming down her face. "Come inside. Please, let us give you dinner at least." "I need to keep moving," Frank said, but the words fell hollow even as he spoke them. "Please," she said again, "just for a little while." Inside the small apartment, Frank found himself surrounded by warmth, by laughter, by life. Carlos's brother, Antonio, insisted on making traditional Mexican food. Children from the building came to play with Miguel and Rosa. Someone found a cake for Rosa's early birthday, and they all sang to her, their voices creating a symphony of belonging that Frank hadn't heard in years. As Rosa blew out her candles, she looked at Frank. "I wish for you to be happy," she announced solemnly, and the room fell silent. Frank felt his eyes burning. "You shouldn't waste your birthday wish on an old man like me, sweetheart." "Not wasted," she said with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. "You were sad. Now you're not." That night, when Frank finally prepared to leave, Carlos pressed a small object into his hand. "My father gave this to me," he said. It was a worn silver medal, a saint Frank didn't recognize. "For protection, for good fortune. You gave us everything when we had nothing. This is all I can give you now." Frank tried to refuse, but Carlos's hand closed over his. "Please, let us give you something. Let us feel like we're not just takers." Frank nodded, unable to speak past a lump in his throat. As he drove away that night, Phoenix's light spreading below him like a carpet of stars, Frank pulled over at a rest stop and called his daughter. It rang 4 times, and he almost hung up. "Dad." Emily's voice was surprised. "It's not Sunday." "I know," Frank said. I wanted to tell you that I love you, and that I want to meet my grandchildren, and that I've been letting grief make my decisions for too long." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of Emily crying. "I've been waiting 7 years to hear you say that." "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry, but I met someone today who reminded me what it means to be human again. Actually, I met 4 someones." They talked for an hour, making plans, bridging the distance that had grown between them. When Frank finally hung up, he sat in his cab with Carlos's medal in his hand, watching the stars emerge from the darkness overhead. He thought about the rules he'd lived by, the walls he'd built. He thought about how easy it would have been to drive past that family in the rain. How one decision, one moment of choosing kindness over convenience, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. Frank had saved them, yes, but as he started his engine and pulled back onto the highway, heading toward Seattle instead of his next scheduled route, he realized the truth. They had saved him too. Some debts can never be repaid because they weren't transactions at all. They were grace, arriving disguised as rain-soaked strangers on a highway shoulder, reminding a lonely man that walls built from grief are no match for a child's small hand or a birthday wish offered with pure and generous love. Frank Morrison had broken his rules that day, and in breaking them, he'd finally found his way back home.